Okay, we're good to go.
Yep. I know, in fact, one of my students is here. Hello, Sarah. And she's heard this before. There are dogs behind me. So just if you hear strange noises, it's the dogs. So thank you. Thanks to Scott for asking me to do this. I had this stretch of being a panhandle archaeologist, actually, when I worked down at Lubbock Lake. And I ended up, life took me to other places kind of by accident and opportunity, which is a little bit what I'm going to talk about today, is how accident and opportunity shapes what we know. We don't talk about that. We don't admit this very often as archaeologists, right? But the fact is that accidents and opportunities shape almost everything we do and everything we can do and everything we find out. And so I want to talk about that sort of in the history of Paleoindian studies a little bit, and then see where we go. So share my screen. Where to go? And I have to say, given what I want to talk about, Scott picked this picture, and when he sent it to me, it was perfect. It could not have been a better choice, because I'm going to talk about Paleoindians, and what we're looking at is a campfire, right? And children. Who would have thought that there would be children in a talk about Paleoindians, or dogs, or people just hanging out and being a family, right? This is not a part of Paleoindian archaeology as it's practiced most of the time. Most of the time, it's practiced about things like this, right? This is, and notice that the hunter here actually does not look like a modern human being, right? He looks like a Neanderthal. But and this is from the Rocky Mountain News in the late 1949, about a site up in Wyoming that the University of Wyoming was excavated, or Smithsonian was excavating, actually, the Horner site, right? But this image of hunting, it's not just in the newspapers, right? But it has turned out to dominate an awful lot of what we know about the Paleoindian periods, or at least what we think we know about the Paleoindian period. And I want to talk a little bit about the accidents that brought us to that, and then suggest an alternative way of thinking about this period of time. So, right, Paleoindian period on the Great Plains. This is early period of when people were here. We break it into all kinds of parts. For these purposes, I'm going to break it into two, and I'm going to ignore the first one. I'm not talking about Clovis, 11,500 to about 10,800. All I'm really focused on here is what we would call Folsom and late Paleoindian. Lots of it on the Southern Plains, all over the Great Plains, about 10,800 to, depending on where you are, maybe 7,000 years ago. And when we think of it, we think of these kinds of artifacts, right? These spectacular spear points, and they are just cool. I mean, they're just really cool. And those are the things that tend to highlight most conversations about the Paleoindian period. And there's reasons for that. And I'm going to suggest that there's limitations on that as well. So Paleoindian archaeology in many ways, really put the Great Plains on the map in North America. 1927, right? The Folsom site changed almost everything that we know, or thought we knew at that time, about the antiquity of Indian people in North America, because they found a Folsom point down in that lower right between two ribs. Not quite, it turns out not to be quite the way we thought it was. It's not stuck in an unbutchered side of ribs, but there's no question about the association of extinct animals and human beings. And that they figured that out from this bison kill in this ancient arroyo in northeastern New Mexico in 1927. Just a few years later, they found the same kinds of spear points at Lindenmeyer, just north of where I am, up in northern Colorado. Not a bison kill in an old arroyo. It's a deeply stratified site. It's huge campsite, covers acres. Lots of different kinds of animals, thousands of artifacts, and look at the sign that they put up, right? First campfire, right? They knew what they were digging in. They knew they were looking at a home place, at a residential place. And so this is just a few years after Folsom. Get up to the 1950s, and Joe Ben Weed from the place where I am right now, from up at the University of Colorado, went out to Eastern Colorado and dug the Olson Chubbuck site, this amazing site. Like Folsom, it's a bison kill in an ancient arroyo. This photograph's called the River of Bones. God help me if I ever have to dig a site like that again. It's like pickup sticks where the sticks fall apart when you start to take them out of the ground. But this amazing archaeological site, but it's this giant bison kill, right? 1960s. Cynthia Irwin Williams and her brother Henry Irwin excavated a whole lot of the Hell Gap site in Wyoming. It's a deeply stratified campsite used for thousands of years, right? It's so, I mean, these two kinds of sites, we've been seeing them decade after decade after decade. We've known about these things since the 1920s, 1930s. 1971, George Frisson dug the Casper site. It's a bison kill, not in an old arroyo, right? Casper's in a parabolic dune. So drive a herd of bison into a sand dune. If you want to slow them down, that's a pretty good way to do it. And you look at this, this is a classic Paleoindian site. We'll talk about what I mean by that in a minute, right? So we've seen hunting places and we've seen living places for decades on the Great Plains. And what I want to suggest is that career choices and career kind of accidents by all of these people and other people too have led us to emphasize one of those over the others. This is Frank Roberts. Frank Roberts dug Lindenmeyer. You'll notice a pattern in a moment or two, but he is the opposite to this pattern. He actually was a Chaco Canyon archaeologist who came out and started working at Lindenmeyer and published some on it. But from the perspective of an ex-department chair, I would say that his career ended the most tragically of all these people because he was really good at organizing things and he was really bad at saying no. And so he got pulled into administration and he ran the River Basin Salvage Projects and the American Bureau of Ethnology and got pulled out of the doing of archaeology into the administering of archaeology. And he still wrote, right? But Lindenmeyer kind of sad because he got pulled away from it. He started off as a Southwesternist, right? So he left. Cynthia Irwin Williams, right, dug up at Hell Gap with her brother Henry Irwin, and Henry died very young. And Cynthia went off to the Southwest at Eastern New Mexico University, and she dug early archaic sites out in the Southwest, and she dug at Salmon Ruin, and she never went back to Hell Gap. The collection just sat at Harvard for decades after she and her brother had finished, and never really wrote it up, right? So her career took her to a different place. This is Marie Wormington. She was, we talk about projectile points all the time and we classify them endlessly. Paleoindian archaeologists are just amazing about that. She was the first person who actually looked at them. Not only did she sort of bring the first order to them, but she's the first person who suggested that the way people make them, the technology of the points, actually mattered as much as the outline form. And that was time sensitive, and we should be thinking about production patterns as well as appearance in looking at this typology. She was at the Denver Museum of Nature, what we today call the Nature and Science. She went off to Western Colorado and dug Southwestern related things and published all that. And then she went up to work up in Alberta in Canada and published something on Canada and came back to Denver and dug some Paleoindian sites, but never finished them, right? So she didn't sort of carry on with a lot of the work that she had started, although she stayed on the Great Plains for a while, for much longer, the rest of her life. This is Joe Ben Wheat from Van Horn, Texas, right? From down in the Trans-Pecos. And Joe Ben came up to where I am and was the curator at our museum for decades and dug Olson Chubbuck and dug the Jurgen site, and he actually published them, but he came up to Colorado and got pulled off into the Southwest and spent most of his career digging the Yellow Jacket site out in the Four Corners. You may notice a trend here, right? They go dig a Paleoindian site and then they go off and become Pueblo archaeologists. And I honestly have no idea why that happens, but it seems to have happened over and over and over again, except it didn't happen to George. This is George Frisson, cover of his autobiography. George was a rancher from up in Wyoming, and he stayed in Wyoming his whole life. That was the best place in the world. It's a perfect place in the world for George. And he was a hunter, and he actually guided hunting, and then he went to graduate school at age 37 and finished up his PhD and came back to teach at the University of Wyoming. And he had a goal and he had a direction, and he made it really clear he wanted to study ancient hunting. And he was really good at it. And studying ancient hunting means looking for evidence of hunting. and he wanted to study it through the whole history of Wyoming on the Northwestern Plains. And that drew him to a particular kind of place. It drew him not, he dug all kinds of sites, but he really was most interested in the kill sites. He was interested in how people hunted bison. How do you take a herd of those massive, powerful animals and control them? And what do you do with them once you've got them? And George spent his career figuring all that out, knew more about that than anybody else. And as he did that, he and other people who were drawn into his research discovered this incredible volume of information you can get from these sites. It's breathtaking how information rich bison kill sites are if you know what you're doing, and George absolutely did, right? You can tell if you have a group of the animals, if you've got a herd, you can tell how many males and how many females you've got by looking at the adult measurements of the adults, right? Bison males and females are sexually dimorphic. There's females are smaller, males are bigger, and these are modern sizes. These are Paleoindian sizes, right? So you see the same kind of clustering at these periods of time, right? So you can say, I've got lots of males in this herd. It's a bachelor herd. That tells me one thing. I've got many fewer males and more females in it, probably a nursery herd. That's a different kind of a thing, and it tells you something different. You can figure out what time of year the kill was made, right? You can look at that. You can age the animals, so you can tell by looking at tooth eruption patterns and how old they were. And you can pick out each year, because bison are born in a particular time of the year, right? They're born in the spring, and you can watch their teeth coming in and their teeth wearing down over the years, and you can figure out their age, and you can figure out the time of year that they were killed. So you can tell if it's a spring kill or a fall kill or a winter kill. You can look at the cut marks on the bones, and we've gotten better and better at doing this kind of work. This is from Lee Bement's work at the Cooper site. Right? We can look at how they butchered the animals, how they handled the carcasses once they had them. Well, how much meat did they take off? How did they dismantle the bones, or did they just leave them articulated? On and on and on. You can look at the behavior, right, around this important activity. I mean, you can learn an immense amount about it, and lots of that drove George's work, and the work of all the people who came to work with him and who took his ideas and his practices to other parts of the Great Plains. And it really focused us on kill sites. And you get artifacts like this. You don't get a lot of them, but you get artifacts like this. And I like stone tools, right? This is, I mean, I've pottery doesn't hurt my brain the way it used to. It used to cause me deep psychic pain to try and read ceramic analysis, but I'm much better now. I've grown up, but I still like stone tools, right? And if there are cooler stone artifacts than Paleoindian projectile points, I don't know what they are, right? And you get them, right? They're full of technological information. You can look at how they're manufactured and the skill that's made. They're made from stone, typically that's quite a ways from the site, right? And so you can identify raw material sources and wonder about how the stone got there, right? So there's all of this stuff that just drew our attention over decades, and because so many of the people who had worked on Paleoindian archaeology, I would argue, drifted away into other things, the folks who stayed are the ones who shaped the field. This is what happens it's what happens in the world. Luck happens to all of us, and it did happen to Paleoindian archaeology. Right? Studying large game hunting is a really powerful way of seeing the past. Right? They're information-rich sites. We know how to look at them. Hunter-gatherer sites, this is no trivial issue. You find a mountain of bison bone eroding out of a cut bank, it's not hard to see. This is not a minor thing on the Great Plains landscape, right? Lots and lots of the things people did on the plains didn't leave a big mark, especially on the Western Plains. Bone beds are very visible. The drama of the event, right? It's exciting to think about, and it attracts lots of attention. And I'll say it again, projectile points from mass kills are just cool. They just are. So what did we learn from all of this? From decades of this? Paleoindian bison kills are not all the same, but they share some important characteristics. They're typically one bone bed, or just a couple of bone beds. And you can see that at Jones Miller in Colorado, or Casper in Wyoming, right? These are not deeply stratified sites. And later bison kills in some parts of the plains truly are deeply, if you go up to the northern plains and look at a jump site, you'll see 4, 5, 6 meters of bison bone laid in on top of each other. That's not what these are like. There are multiple kills in some cases, although not many, but they're single bone beds. And if you look at that Casper one, the noses of all those bison are pointing the same way. You can tell which way they were running, right? They were running from left to right. And if you look at those bones, they're in articulated position, right? You can see the vertebral columns. Where's my cursor? Right in there, right? And there's the shoulder blades, and they're going this way. So these are, you can look at them and you can say they could have got more off those kills. And you can see that over and over again. They butchered these animals, no doubt about it, but they could have gotten more from these kills. This is the Horner site. So you get this jumble of bones kind of at the top of the bone bed, but if you peel that off, that's a whole bison right there, right? That's a whole bison. That's damn near the whole thing, right? They're not handling these things in ways that maximize what they could get out of the kill. And you find that over and over and over again in these big kills, not little kills, but in the big kills. They do that. This is the Cooper site in Oklahoma, in western Oklahoma, that Lee Bentman. There's a younger version of Lee, right, with this amazing, the oldest painted object in North America is this skull from the Cooper site. They painted these red zigzags on it, and used it probably for a ceremony. These is 3 kills, and they use this to probably some kind of ritual to draw the bison into the second kill. But look at it again, right? Here's the ribs all laid out in order. They're butchering these days, cut marks all over these animals, and you can figure out just how they handled them, but they didn't disarticulate the animals the way they did in later times. And this is Olson Chubbuck, right? Same thing again. These are just entertaining pictures that Chauvin did. Here's that river of bones, and you can see them laid out in this arroyo, right? And you can see the scale of what they did. And they left these behind completely untouched, right? There was nothing on this animal. I don't know how they would have gotten it out. The bison are kind of heavy. It's down at the bottom of the arroyo. But right, they're killing these whole herds. They've got all the skills and the knowledge and the technology that it takes to control these animals. And then they process them, and we can see it, right? You can't quite watch them doing it, and there's plenty of mysteries. Nobody knows how they controlled the herds of animals at Jones Miller. It's not always obvious, but we've learned this incredible amount. And when you look at the stone artifacts, right, I said they're often made from rock that's a long way off. So this is the Olson Chubbuck. It is right here in eastern Colorado. And if you're looking at these kinds of points, they're not just beautiful, which they are, but this one and this one are from the Knife River quarries up in North Dakota. That's a long walk, right? And there's artifacts at Olson Chubbuck from Alabates, as well as from sources in Colorado. From Alabates and from Edwards Plateau. I can read a map. I forget sometimes where I'm looking at. That's a long walk to get to those places, and there's nothing unusual about that. This is a map of the Folsom, the original Folsom site, right? This are the raw material sources of the Folsom site. Maybe not quite as far as Olson Chubbuck, but Flat Top Quarries up in northeastern Colorado is a long walk from Folsom, New Mexico. And so is Toccova's sources in Palador Canyon, right? And so people built this picture of folks built out of all this kind of information. So they rarely reused these kill sites, and they never reused them often. Maybe 3 times at Cooper is the most in any one of these specific kill locations. They reused regions, right? The Beaver River Valley in western Oklahoma is a really good example of that. It's places where they seem to have concentrated their activity, but they didn't concentrate their activity at a particular place. And that really contrasts sharply with what we can see sometimes in other places. I'm getting questions. There's a question in the chat. What time period is the Cooper site? Thank you. I skipped those over. Cooper is a Folsom site. So it's same age as Folsom, same age as those. It's one of the earliest of these big kills. Right? They did not invest in features. So when you look at a lot of later hunting, you've got to control these herds, right? If they don't go where you want them to, you're out of luck. And so later people would build corrals sometimes, and they would build drive lines to help guide the herds in. No evidence of any kind the Paleoindians did that. And they didn't attempt to get all the food they could have gotten when they butchered, right? They certainly took less off these animals than later hunters did. And when you look at seasonality, they show up in all times of the year, although that's a little misleading because there's some geographic patterns in that. And they relied on these sophisticated tools that are made from stone from distant areas, right? So you look at this behavior and you go, what's going on? How do you make sense out of this? And the story that we have told about how they moved around the landscape is that they're big game specialists that never stayed long in one place, right? They're not reusing any of these sites. They didn't move in patterned ways, right? There's no reuse. If they were cycling through a series of locations, you would think they would reuse some of these places. They were hunting all the time, and they were covering immense regions, right? They were going from North Dakota all the way down into eastern Colorado and down into Texas, and somehow doing that in a way that allowed them to have artifacts, tools from all those places in their hands at one time. And this does not resemble what more recent people's ways of life look like. And people spend a lot of time, still find people who will talk about this kind of thing, which might suggest to you that I'm going to say it's not quite right, which is what I'm going to say. So that's entirely built on kill sites. Right. And what we had for years, we had these campsites in the world and some other ones, but never finished, never that visible. And if you read introductory texts in North American archaeology that were written before about 1970, they'll mention campsites when they talk about the Paleoindian period. They get past 1970, Casper site, and the explosion of amazing archaeology that George and the people who worked with him did. And suddenly campsites disappear from those introductory texts. And that speaks to what people are thinking about and to what people are writing about and publishing and talking about. I want to look at one of these other sites, and it's actually an old one. I didn't show it in those intro ones, but I want to talk about the Allen site in southwestern Nebraska. I love this map. It's because it's drawn by Mott Davis, who taught it down at UT Austin for decades, and wrote his dissertation on these sites and dug a couple of them. And this is hand drawn and hand colored by Mott. So there's a series of these Paleoindian sites along. Here's Medicine Creek right down here, and this is Lime Creek here, and there's these two big sort of workshop area quarry sites. I'm going to focus on this one that's right on the main axis of the creek, the Allen site. Medicine Creek is a really good place to live if you're a hunting person. It is sheltered, right? It's dissected down below the prairie uplands. So it's sheltered. It's got trees and good water. It's loaded with jasper. This is a solid seam of flakable stone that it's not all equally good, and you'll see what I mean. But it's usable, and there's plenty of it. That's quite good quality. Right, so it had everything you would need to draw somebody in to live there, and it did. It drew people in. Excuse me. I gotta say, archaeology is not quite as much fun as it used to be. They used to be able to use dynamite and bulldozers to get down into archaeological sites. My partner and colleague won't even let me have a backhoe right now, so which disappoints me deeply. She's not listening right now, I don't think. Maybe she is. But this is what people had to do in the 1950s, late 1940s and 1950s to get down into these sites. That, right, we just, we get in so much trouble if we try to get undergraduates to do that these days. That's 60 feet down, and they did literally use dynamite and bulldozers to get down to the Lime Creek site. This is the Allen site, 25 feet below the surface, right? So this is the occupation level covered by all this other sediment. They're hard to get to. They're easy to see in the cut banks, but they're a little bit hard to get to. This is what the excavation looked like, right? It's really orderly, 5-foot squares. They peeled that sediment away in 2-inch levels, and they saved everything they could see. They're good archaeologists back in 1948, 1949. They did a good job on this site. Not perfect, but still good. This is what their excavation looked like. So the cut bank, there's a cut bank here, the creek is out here, and they've dug this big block excavation. What did they find? I just said all the cool artifacts, all the cool projector points, and not much else. A handful of butchering tools come out of those big kill sites. Out of the Allen site, they got projectile points. This one's not too bad. This is not lovely, right? It's a little bit lumpy. It's not very big. If you didn't come out of a 10,000-year-old level, you might not think it's Paleoindian at all. Every single, and then there's unfinished ones that they just threw away. There are finished and unfinished knives, right? Here's the bases of finished bases of bifacial knives, and then preforms. They were making lots of tools. They had hammerstones right there that they were making, using to make them. All of this rock, actually, including the hammerstones, is made out of that local jasper. Right there, that one point in the upper right is alabates. That's almost the only artifact from the entire site that is not made of the local stone. And I'm not exaggerating at all. I could take every object that's not made out of Smoky Hill jasper and hold it in my hand, out of 13,000 flakes and all of these points and bifaces and all of the other tools. Almost nothing comes from anywhere except either within that drainage or really close to that drainage. So there's lots of stone tool manufacture, and there's lots of stone tool use. There's hide working going on. So they were making these tools with these probably perforating tools where you a good area of the tool to hold on to, and then the business end down here, and you can drive that through a hide and make a hole to sew with if you want to. If you're processing the hides, you can use these as scraping tools, right? The scraping edge is right down here, and we could actually see this is marking the hafting, how these things were hafted. So we could see them being put in handles and pulled out of handles and thrown away and replaced and used to work hide, and then doing things with the hides that they're processing, right? This is not a kill site, spectacularly not a kill site. Lots and lots of simple flake tools. We talk about how elaborate Paleoindian technology is. And what we mean is that it's hard to make their points. Most of Paleoindian technology is like most other people's technology, flake tools. And it's like these, and these are real simple. They're one blow of a hammer and you've got this, and I can show you that in a minute. I said perforate holes so you can stitch clothing and tents and bags and things, and we have the needles that they use to do that with. We've got bone perforating tools. We've got this, and then I have no idea what this is. That's not true, but it doesn't make any sense. If you tried to actually work with that as a handheld tool, you would damage yourself. Look how short it is, just a couple inches long. You would drive one sharp end of it into your hand from doing stuff. Like, might be in California, those are called fishing gorges, and you tie a string around here, bait this against the string, and then it turns in the fish's throat. And in fact, there's fish bone from the Allen site, but I don't believe for a second that they needed to use this. So I have no idea what it is really. This bone tool is made from the ulna of a canid, a wolf, or a really big dog. That's a good sized animal. And they made its bone into a tool. And we have grinding stones, right? This is a mano that's been resharpened, and that is not Paleoindian. That is from somebody who glued it to a wall for a museum exhibit, so that people could see the back of it, which looks like a rock, instead of the front of it, which looks like a tool. This is a piece of a matadi, a really thin slab matadi that broke and then was reused as an abrader. And you can see these narrow places where people could have ground down or sharpened things like needles, right? So they're making tools to make tools, and they're using all these crafts. There's all these crafts represented, including some that we just don't know anything about. This is something. No, don't know what it is. I had an undergraduate one time to say that it's a preform for a yo-yo, which is as plausible as anything else. That groove goes all the way around the sides of it. It's also could be a weight for a net. It could be something that you can attach to a string and use if you had three of them as a bola, right? So there's this diversity of things. These are the things of everyday life, right? This is not a kill site. This is what we would think a campsite should look like. And people should keep warm in a campsite. And we have fireplaces. They found like 20 of them, and they brought one back to the lab, right? So they cut a pedestal right around here, covered it with plaster, sealed it over, and then carried it back to Lincoln. And what you're seeing right in there is where the fire burned, right? That's all the ashy sediment left from burning the fire, and this dark ring around is where the sediment got changed by the heat, right? So right, this is what we expect to see in a residential kind of a site. What kind of animals did they bring back to that site? everything they could find is what it sure looks like. There's bison and deer and antelope and right coyote, wolf, badger, beaver. We have some beaver bone. We have lots of beaver bone at Lime Creek, a little bit at Allen. Cottontails, jackrabbits, prairie dogs, all with cut marks and burning marks on them. There's eagle and goose and hawk in there, which are interesting. And those are eagle and hawk are not necessarily things that you would eat. There's lots of little perching birds too, but those probably just sat up in the trees and died, fell down into the site. Turtle and frog. There's catfish, right? And there's mussels right here. We have freshwater mussels on the Paleoindian side. No, I should have bison bone bed pictures, and instead I've got mussels. The Allen site's different than those big bison kill sites, although there's a range of animals present at Hell Gap, and there's a range of animals present at Lindenmeyer. We can see the hunting in some detail, and it turns out that it looks really local. That is, these are aggregate depictions of what body parts did people carry back to the Allen site, right? Because you're presumably not killing the animals right by the campfire, right? And we got head to toe pretty much. So this is we'll talk about these levels in a minute. This is the oldest level. It's about Folsom age. Here's a little bit level that comes a little bit later, the intermediate zone, level 2, right? So we've got bison, we've got deer, we've got antelope, and it looks like antelope or a deer, you can field dress it and throw it over your shoulder and carry it home, but not so much with a bison, right? We've got parts of the whole animal. They seem to be taking these creatures in small numbers and not very far away. Okay, what does it tell us? We could see the landscape changing, right? So the period of time we're really interested in is in here. It started off maybe 15,000, 16,000 years ago as this broad open valley, and then there was a period of erosion. So when Paleoindian people lived there, they were living inside a landscape that looked pretty much like this picture. So there are these long terraces, long open terraces, and our work indicates that it was filled with trees. There were sort of deciduous trees down in here. There were more pines and spruces and things like that up in the upper reaches of the drainage. And this was an open grassland. The uplands were an open grassland. And over the time that people lived there and then afterwards, sediment just accumulated, right? So anybody that left, archaeologists love this, right? Because you could live on these terraces, leave your stuff behind, and then it would get covered up and buried, and archaeologists could come back and look at it, right? So the period of time that we're looking at, we'll come back to this in a moment, there will be a test, right? You can see stuff accumulating over time and burying the assemblages as we go by. This is what the stratigraphy looks like. It's pretty simple. Accumulation of sediment, paused for a minute, paused for a couple of centuries probably. We call that occupation level 1. It accumulated again. That accumulation we call the intermediate zone, and then it came up and it paused again, and that second pause we'll call occupation level 2. So we've got 3 different stratigraphic units, and it started, the period of time when there's archaeology, 11,000, 10,500 maybe to 8,500. So 2,000, 2,500 years. And we've got radiocarbon dates to pin that down fairly well. I said we had fireplaces, right? They had like 20 of them. Fireplaces throughout, right? And fireplaces are great because they can't move around. These only archaeologists can dig them out and take them back to the lab, right? When you see them, you know that that's where somebody burned a fire. And we know that they burned fires below the surface of occupation level 1. We know they burned it in here. We know they burned fires through the intermediate zone. They burned fires on the occupation level 2, right? So this is constant kind of use of the site. Right, this doesn't look like a bison kill that they might have used only once or twice. Lots and lots of stone tools, and we could put some of them back together. We could refit them. And I said I'd show you how simple the technology is. This is a series of flakes, like those big flake tools I showed you. You just hit one, right? These are single blows from the simplest kind of core there is, single platform core, and they just struck flakes around the edge. This is not complicated technology. And they made lots of bifaces. This one broke right here, and you could see them trying to recover it. They drove a flake down from the broken edge. They decided they didn't like it. They used it probably to scrub the edge of a biface while they were flaking it. Right, so we can put these things together, and there's a reason to do that, because that tells us, I said, fireplaces can't move. right? They sit where they are unless an archaeologist takes it to the lab, but artifacts can move, and they do all the time. Freezing and thawing and water flowing moves things up and down in the sediment and down slopes. And when we look at the spatial pattern of refits, nothing moved up and down. The site is much more intact than I expected it to be. And there's very little downslope movement at all, right? And we can tell that because we've got refit, because of the refitting that we were able to do. And that's really interesting, because when when you go back to the records that the folks that dug the site kept, and I said they're good archaeologists because they were, we can map out all the things that they found, and there's piles of them, right? So whoever was excavating, right, these are 5-foot squares, whoever was excavating right in here had a really boring day, right? Because that person didn't find anything. And whoever was excavating here had a pretty exciting day because they couldn't put that trowel in the ground without getting something out, right? This is hundreds and hundreds. These are piles of hundreds of artifacts, right? And you can see the hearths, right? So there's a big pile of trash here. We don't have good provenience information on all the bone, but where we do have it, we can see that that these are general trash piles. There's bone in with the stone artifacts, right? And the hearths all miss the big concentrations. And that's weird because that one is OL1, right? 11,500, 11,000, 10,500 Folsom times. This is the intermediate zone, maybe 9,000. This is the upper one, maybe 8,500. And that pile is that pile, and it's that pile, right? And that pile is that one, and that pile is that one. I just said the artifacts aren't moving up and down in these sediments because we refitted and we can show that they're not. And yet people they didn't just throw trash away in the site for 2,000, 2,500 years. They threw trash away on the same trash pile. And the only reason that I can come up, the only explanation come up that makes any sense out of that at all, is that the trash piles were still visible from the last time somebody was there when the next time somebody was there, right? And I said, archaeologists love the Allen site. Sediment's accumulating, it's burying the collection, it's preserving us for it. That's why people could go there in 1948, 1949 and dig it. But that sediment was apparently not accumulating faster than people were coming back to that place. Because when they went to throw their trash away from this time, they were like, oh, let's throw it away on the trash that, whoever was here before me, because that pile's right over there. So why not, right? We do this today. I had a roommate in college who told me he was taking the trash out and decided not to because he went out the front door and he saw that one of my neighbors had put their trash out on the street instead of taking it around the back. So he threw our trash on top of the neighbor's trash, right? Just like people at the Allen site. But a letter addressed to me was in that trash when he threw it out. And when the trash police came by and decided who they were going to issue a ticket to, it came to me and I had to go to court. So I know that this is it was wonderful. Let me tell you, it's just what I wanted to do. So I know this is a human universal. So change over time, right? So we've got this site, people are building fires there, they're coming back regularly, they're coming back quite frequently. I can't give you how many years, but I can't explain that pattern in any other way than the way I just did. We know that it's this constant use. Did it change over time, right? Because Paleoindian bison hunting, all those bone beds that I showed you date to all these different periods of times, and there's others as well, and they don't seem to change until the very, very end of that period, and they don't change much even then, right? So that's a really stable, continuous kind of pattern of behavior. At the Allen site, we've got the same basic range of artifacts from top to bottom. It's a campsite from top to bottom. If you look at those hearths, you can tell how long they burned a fire in them, because the size of it and the degree of burning changes to, on a fire that's burned longer, and they're shorter, and the percentage of really heavily burned hearths drops as you go up. So over time, it seems like they were burning fires for shorter periods of time, which sure sounds like one measure of how long they were staying there. Lots of bison in the lowest level, not so much in the upper levels. Deer and pronghorn become much more common in those upper two levels, and so does small game, things like rabbits and prairie dogs. And if you categorize those into upland and riparian, right? Animals you would have had to go out across the prairie to get, versus animals that you would find right down in the drainage. The animals that you'd find right down in the drainage become more common in that site over time. Things like deer that would have been in the cuts of Medicine Creek and Cottontail instead of jackrabbit, fish that they would come out and get out of the water, mussels, those increase over time. Fish are great too, because you can get seasons when they grow their vertebrae grow like trees a little bit, so they get dark and light rings. And it turns out that the fish vertebrae that we get are from the summer. And I said I didn't think they need fishing tackle, but streams like Medicine Creek their flow drops as you get into the fall, late summer and early fall, and they form backwater ponds. And we know there were backwater ponds in there because the species of mussels that we get out of the site come from backwater ponds, and as well as freshly flowing water. And these days, if you want to get catfish in the late summer or early fall on the Central Plains, you just go out to one of those backwater ponds where they're oxygen deprived, and you just scoop them up and toss them in a basket and take them home. You don't need fishing tackle to get fish at that time of year out of this kind of an environment. So how did the people at the Allen site use the landscape, right? This is broad scale resource use, including large and small animals and aquatic species. And it changed over time, but you can find pieces of that throughout the entire occupation. It's repetitive short-term use of a specific location. It's not like this Paleoindian bison hunting. It's small scale non-communal hunting. It's very limited evidence for long distance raw material movement, almost none, right? Which is to say, it's nearly as close to the opposite as you can get from what people have seen in big bison kills. So what do we do, right? Why is this so different? And there is an answer. There is an answer, or at least a partial answer. There's a way of bridging these two. And it's especially, notice that these different parts of this depend on different kinds of evidence, right? This immense region part really depends on the stone tools. The rest of this seems to, pretty much depends on just the way they hunted and what the bone beds themselves tell us. So there's a solution, but it depends on luck, right? I started off saying, what's the luck of the history of excavation and analysis in the Paleoindian period? Well, how did different scholars come in and out of the field? This is luck too, but it's a different kind. It depends on the interested public. This is Ryan's cache. It's from Lubbock County. Sonny Lupton and his son Ryan Lupton were working on a farm just outside Lubbock, and found this cache, and they took it into Texas Tech University, into the museum. And it's a cache of stone tools, and it is finished and unfinished projectile points and butchery tools, and they're all made from distant stone, right? They're made from Edwards Plateau chert, and they're made from, I think, alabates, right? And what I just described is the stone tool assemblage that you get from a large kill, right? Except that there's unfinished. There's not much you can do with an unfinished projectile point. If you're hunting bison, you want it to be ready, right? But this is otherwise basically the same thing that you get out of a communal kill, and it's not the only one that's like that. This one's from southern Nebraska. It's called the Harmon cache. Back in the 1930s, a farmer named Jack Harmon was working his farm, and he plowed up a cache of these, and these are actually pretty close to the same age as Ryan's cache. These are Cody points, and mostly unfinished ones. And there's butchery tools or potential butchery tools, right? And these are the finished points, and then here's all of these unfinished points, right? And you can draw those maps for the Harmon, right? For the Harmon cache. So there's material out of Missouri, and there's material out of eastern Kansas, and there's material from the Flat Top Quarry out of northeastern Colorado, and then the big chunk of that stuff is that same Smoky Hills jasper that you get at the Allen site. And so if I was going to argue the traditional Paleoindian argument, I'd have to figure out how people had walked from near Sterling, Colorado, all the way over into Missouri and then down into eastern Kansas and back. But when Jack Harmon got these, He just walked from his back door out to his cornfield and he picked him up. And so could anybody, any Paleoindian out in that part of the world. That whole argument about massive movements depends on assuming that there's only one way that people could collect stone tools, and that's by going to the quarry. And in fact, there are caches like this dotted across the Great Plains, and the ones that there's no Folsom caches. No one's found one of those yet that they think is real. There's one that, but there's a fair argument. No one actually knows if it's true or not, but it might have been made by a modern flint knapper. But the other ones show patterns like this. They're filled with unfinished and finished projectile points. And it's easy to explain the assemblages you get from big bison kill sites by looking back at these kinds of collections of artifacts. It doesn't require massive movements. And once you take that out of the equation, all of this looks different, right? Camps are where people lived, kills are where they hunted, right? Neither one of those things by itself tells us what we want to know. What we can see if we weave all of this together is this ancient use of the plains landscape where people were tied to good residential places, good places to live. And they came back to those places over and over again, right? And they didn't use them in the same way that they used hunting places. And that's the same as later people in the plains is the same as later people today, right? And just to go back to the beginning, right? So we can see a richer and more complex kind of a pattern of land use at this ancient period of time. But to do that, we need all of these kinds of evidence. We have had that evidence since our earliest days of Paleoindian archaeology, right? Since the 1920s and 1930s, we have known about this diversity. Lindenmayer truly does not look like the Folsom site, even though they're the same age. And yet Lindenmayer never, until more recently, what people took away from it were the projector points. And flint knappers tried to, everybody wanted to reproduce the Lindenmayer Folsom, right? It's the luck of persistent academic careers and the interests of important archaeologists that has truly shaped the way we think about and emphasize these different kinds of sites. That's true everywhere. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I'm saying this is the nature of the history of archaeology. And what we need to do as archaeologists is be aware of it and build a recognition of it into the way we think about the material that's available to us. And in this case, the other luck that has really mattered is the luck of local communities that are interested in archaeology. And that's, I would argue, helps. That's what helps to bridge all of these different ideas. So thank you. I'll stop sharing.